Welcome to this professional skills session briefing. We're talking about effective teams, so I hope you are all in the right place. My name is Mariann Hardey. I'm going to be chairing the session. I'm part of, oh, thank you, Peter, just seeing your message. I'm part of the Advanced Research Computing Group at Durham, and lots of members of my team are currently in the audience and indeed have been speaking over the past week, so I'm sure you're very familiar with them. I'm also an academic, and I research tech communities and advocacy and support within those tech communities, in particular women in tech groups, which is nice because there's a good link to this morning's session concerning computing teams and indeed how we kind of build in our people infrastructure. So in this session, we're going to explore the sorts of roles that manifest within research computing units and how these have developed, what the common traits are, a bit about the culture, some of the value and the key relationships that are there, okay? It's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you the panelists for this morning's session, of which we have joining 4 members this morning. So we have Alys Brett, Oz Parchment, Mark Turner, and Marion Weinzierl. So if I could go over to the panelists, and please can you take some time to introduce yourself? So think of this as an elevator pitch. You know, a couple of minutes to say who you are, where you're from, and a little bit of perhaps about what you want to get out of this morning's session. Alys, starting with you, and then if you could nominate the next person to speak, please, that will probably be easiest.
Sure, hello. I will assume everyone can hear me unless I hear otherwise. So I'm Alys Brett, and I'm head of the software engineering group at the UK Atomic Energy Authority. I understand there's some people in the room from there, so hello. I'm not entirely sure who it is. I came into this world, I had a theoretical physics background originally, and then I got into web development and databases and things like that for Oxford University for a while. And then I came to work at UK Atomic Energy Authority as a software engineer, being able to combine my sort of physics background and software engineering interests, creating data systems and tools for the JET experiment, which is the largest fusion reactor in the world currently. I sort of went on to lead that team that I was part of, and I would say they were very much like research software engineers, research data engineers in skill set, though it was before I'd come across any of those terms. I then broadened that out, and we formed a wider software engineering group, combining that team and another one, which focused on more like database and web systems for business information. And around this time, I sort of became aware of the wider research software engineering community and research software community through a SSI fellowship that a lot of people might be aware of, which is a marvelous opportunity to get involved in that community. And then I became aware of the emerging UK RSE Association. So the attempt to build some community around these roles and a bit of an identity for them. And I really recognised this. And so I moved on to found a research software engineering group team within my group at UKAEA, because whilst we had people with those skill sets, they did not have the sort of the time or the operational model that would allow them to contribute to research software projects all across the organisation, of which there were very many, many groups developing software. And so that's really taken off, and now we've got a group of 35 software engineers in three separate teams, and the research software team in particular has grown really fast, getting to about 17 people now. And finally, we're in the middle of a merger of the 2 different departments at UKAEA that do this kind of research technology work. So we're merging together with the Advanced Research Computing Department, and there's a much broader set of roles across the 2 departments that could fall into that category of research technology professionals. So I'm interested in how the experience with the RSE community and roles and teams can sort of translate which bits do and don't cross over into other related disciplines. Thank you. And I'll nominate the next person. How about Marion in the room?
Yeah, sure. Hi. So my name is Marion Weinzierl. I'm an RSE at Durham, and I'm also the RSE theme lead in an HCIR. And in that role, I'm I don't want to say leading, I'm kind of in charge of the Beat support group, so I'm negotiating work and facilitating the work in that group, which is especially interesting because I don't have any line management authority over the group, and it's distributed over 8 universities, so I can talk about that a bit, and I can also, maybe if it's relevant, talk about my experience of being in teams both in industry and in academia in various ways. And I nominate Mark as next speaker.
Hello everyone, my name is Mark Turner. I'm Head of Research Software Engineering at Newcastle University. I've been at the university for about 10 years, and I founded and lead the team 4 years ago in 2018. I engaged more with the RSE society, as it was an association. Then when Alys took over as chair in 2018, I joined that committee and was part of the group that turned it into a society and a registered charity, so I've been doing some community work. I've stepped back from that to grow the team at Newcastle, so we're now up to 18 RSEs. And so today I'm interested in people's thoughts on how you go through the growing pains of going from sort of 3 or 4 people and bringing in middle management and all that kind of thing. And a final point, I'm the programme chair for the RSE conference this year in September, so please submit things to that. Submissions are open. And I nominate Oz.
Hi, I'm Oz Parchment. I'm Associate Director for Research Computing at Cambridge. I've kind of been in as a research technology professional. Okay. So I've been one of those for 2-3 decades, I suppose, quite a while. I did my PhD here in Manchester, which is interesting. I think this is the second time I've been back to Manchester since. It is completely different. Jeez, I don't recognise anything at all apart from this building, which is exactly the same. So I've worked with teams, small teams of 2 or 3 people, up to divisions of 200-300 people I've looked after in my time. So not such on the, not just all on the research technology side, but in generic IT terms. So looking after big IT teams and research technology professional teams. I am a chemist. Apparently once you're a chemist, you're always a chemist, so I'm a chemist. I've not done any chemistry for a very, very long time. I suppose what I'm interested here, I think, just looking around the room, what's really interesting is it's been very clear to me that one of the fastest growing areas in this sort of RTP has been in the RSE world. So I don't have a huge amount of experience in RSEs. We have a smallish group at Cambridge of 6 or 7 core, but we're tripling that probably within the next year, if I can hire that many people, if there are that many out there. So I'm interested in how people have kind of grown their RSE teams and what that's looked like. That's it from me.
It strikes me that growth seems to be a key factor in terms of certainly what we'll be talking about this morning. And Mark, I really appreciated your reflection there on kind of the growing pains in terms of scaling up those kinds of teams. Maybe a good place to begin then, before we get into kind of the growth and involving the middle management people, is thinking about the role of research technology professionals. Kind of what roles are we talking about here? How widely do these vary, and kind of what are the common threads? Alys, would you perhaps like to kick us off here?
Right, yes, I've been thinking about this a bit recently because of lots of thinking about, in the abstract terms, about roles and structures and groups to do with this department merger. And also because it gets brought up a lot now. I think it's in the wider environment, it's being discussed that we need to think more broadly. The people who've been involved in the RSE community need to think more broadly then about other research technology roles. So some that I can identify, I think in addition to the research software engineers, there are some very similar kinds of roles in the research data related areas, and there's a whole slew of different words for different sort of nuances of roles to do with research data, but broadly things to do with data management, data scientists, and sort of what I might term data engineers, who are maybe software engineers who are focusing on building data systems and tools and data pipelines and this kind of thing. I think then also we can think about research infrastructure engineers is maybe a good term for it, people who might in the past have been called sysadmins and things like this, but the way that work is being done is changing, and specifically the research-focused platforms and infrastructure. It's a much more exploratory, sort of innovative, automated kind of a role. So infrastructure engineering is a good term for it, I think, or some people are using ResOps, I think. And then there's a lot more, in my world, there's a lot of other kinds of engineering, research, other kinds of engineering, you know, people who are doing engineering for big experiments and facilities and things like this in a very exploratory, research-driven way. Maybe control and instrumentation specialists, for instance, doing advanced real-time control systems or robotics or this kind of thing. And then quite a lot of supporting or sort of peripheral roles that overlap with other areas, like technical project managers, technical writers, all sorts of other things that could operate in that same way, enabling research technology for other people's research goals, really.
Thank you. Oz, it struck me when you were talking and you were reflecting on, you know, your 2 to 3 decades worth of experience in this area, that you must have seen a lot of change in the conditions and even kind of the roles and responsibility, the descriptions we use for these kinds of professionals. Do you have anything that you can add to that in terms of your personal experience, or even kind of the roles and responsibilities of teams that you are currently or have worked with in the past?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it has changed dramatically, right? I mean, you know, I think anyone who's been in this game for a while, you start off with, you know, 2 or 3 sysadmins, basically, who are kind of jack of all trades. They can do, you know, bit of scripting, they can do quite deep MPI programming, they can manage, you know, giant infrastructures. I think over the years, what I have seen is specialization, effectively. So you've got those two or three people. They have, you know, 4 or 5 different skill sets, and all we're doing now is we're saying, you know, this skill set is we're growing teams around individual skill sets that we all had in, you know, 2 or 3 people. So a research software engineer kind of appeared 10, 15 years ago, but actually, you know, sysadmins were research software engineers 20, 30 years ago. That's what they were doing, right? So we've just said, look, this is really important. It's growing bigger. How are we going to create careers around this kind of activity? How are we going to create services around this kind of activity? So let's explode that activity out. I think certainly in terms of the infrastructure engineers, their roles are becoming much more specific now. I mean, the move to I suppose more cloudy type activities have made their roles very special, in a way that they perhaps weren't so. Well, they were, but even more so now, right? So that whole research infrastructure engineers are becoming now much more siloed. Maybe this is also one of the things that I kind of do want to pick up on a little bit, is the risk of siloing these people and the risk of not having this overlap. Where before you had individuals who did multiple roles and there were always kind of overlaps between what they did. Now I think, you know, that there is a real risk within these big teams that you end up with these little silos, these silos of activity, where the RSEs do their RSE thing, where the infrastructure engineer do their infrastructure engineering thing, and there the twain shall meet, right? They don't talk to each other, they're big siloed groups. But I think effectively over the last 20 years, what effectively I have seen is that most of the skills that individuals had are now being groups are being set up around those skills. They're just being expanded on. I suppose that's the big change that I've seen over the last 20 years.
And Mark, you were bringing forward your experience within your role within the charity, but also the major growth that you've seen and experienced at Newcastle. I'm just wondering if you also have seen a similar risk of siloing as Oz has explained, and kind of where you see we're able to compensate for that in the future, or how we might need to restructure teams as they get bigger and do start to take on middle management and indeed other roles within the technical aspects too. Alongside that, because I'm aware that you're sat at Newcastle, in terms of your role, do you see, as an additional question I'm now throwing at you, do you see that there's a tension or a pathway that can be secured between, you know, the roles of RSEs and the kind of the technical aspects there, and some of the requests that researchers and academics might make of those kinds of teams? What do you think?
Okay, so first question. Yes, the siloing thing is something that I also worry about, but I think just having it in your mind when you're making all kinds of decisions, when you're leading an RSE team, is enough for now. I don't think it needs any major sort of strategic intervention at this moment in time. I think you just need to have it in your mind when you're recruiting people, when you're assigning RSEs to particular projects. An example of that would be if I notice that someone in my team is being repeatedly deployed to very similar projects using similar technologies, or maybe with the same research group, something like that, I think to myself, the next time I'm deploying that person, I would try to give them something a bit different, just to give them room to grow and try and experience other things to avoid that siloing mentality. So I don't have like a formal way of dealing with it. I just keep it in my mind when I'm making decisions of various different types. To the question about the tension between academics and RSEs and what's expected of them. Again, we don't have a formal thing for that, but that's something we're working on. So at the moment it relies on me or someone from the group clearly explaining to the academic that we're working on a project with what the rules of engagement are and what RSEs are and how it all works. For the most part, that's worked perfectly. We, like many other groups around the country, are working on documents that have sort of become known as researcher handbooks or that kind of thing. I know Sheffield has one, and we're working on one as well. There's a bit more of a formal document that explains the rules of the road for working with the RSE team, so that researchers coming into that know what the expectations are, they know what we're going to do, what we expect of the researcher, and vice versa, so that that relationship is explained pretty clearly up front. That's what we're aiming for.
Mariann, I wonder if you wanted to talk about kind of the specialization of particular tech roles within the RSE teams, and particularly your role in terms of advocacy within different tech communities, such as Women HPC and other communities that you are involved with and indeed lead on. What do you think about the specialization of different roles by technical teams, and sort of where, if you wanted to reflect a little bit, where do you see your future within those kinds of roles in terms of development or indeed team development?
Yeah, there are two parts of it actually, and one is going into the opposite direction of what was currently explained, and that is what we've seen in the BEAT support group. So in the grant that was put in for the Tier 2 machine, they said, okay, we need BEAT RSEs. And we were then calling onto the institutions who had committed 1 FTE to bring in the BEAT RSEs, the 1 FTE BEAT RSE of each university. But the group that we got together weren't all RSEs. So there were research infrastructure engineers, there were HPC specialists, there were RSEs, so all sorts of people, and that was actually what we needed. So we didn't need the pure RSE work, we needed a team of people who were able to support the researchers at their institution, but also write documentation and sort out issues on the machine, and it's a lot of negotiation to make this work and to talk to the different institutions and make sure that not one or two institutions do all the work and the others basically just focus on their researchers. And so I think it's really important for these kind of services to have a breadth of different roles there and expertises and experiences. On the other part of the question, so other different roles, so I think one role that came up recently, and we have Claire here in the audience somewhere, is the role of a community manager. And I think that has become very important, and they have their own community by now, and maybe Claire can say more about that at some point. So people who actually facilitate the community to come together, people who know the community, people who make connections between people at various institutions, nationally and internationally, and also talk to funders. So I know that Claire is is in contact with the funders, and she's very visible in the RSE society as well. So there are lots of different non-technical roles which are essential as well for our community.
Just picking up on a comment in the chat here from Azam, who's talking about the growth within the team infrastructure, within these kinds of technical roles. And I'll just read part of the comment. So initially we were a few people part-time, and as Odd said, we had to do everything from looking after the infrastructure to outreach and training, and goes on to reflect on, some of us who have been part of this for a couple of decades still like to generalize, but the role we are now assigned limit us, but this is a benefit for the whole group. And I think we can see that there is this perhaps a little tension within the team buildings, and indeed the need for the role of community managers in the way that Marion has just talked about, where, previously perhaps it was beneficial for the group to have specialist roles and people working on, like-for-like projects, but actually that wasn't allowing any kind of development or diversification or growth within that skill set, certainly at a career level. And now, we've got a much more formal career pathway, certainly within, academia, where I have worked for a long time, but also other organizations and institutions who are benefiting from these kinds of research technical enabled roles. And I guess some of the cross-cutting and what the culture is needing to do is sort of have a bit more flexibility within the heart of it to look at, the value of these kinds of roles, but also the knowledge around the expectations for what people who desire these kinds of services, like academics, like researchers, can expect. And it struck me that was particularly relevant when you were talking, Mark, with regards to the workbook you're putting together about the roles and responsibilities of your particular team at Newcastle. Perhaps then this takes us nicely into the culture of RSEs, of research development at the heart of it. And maybe one thing that would be good to talk about amongst us would be sort of the emergent team culture around these kinds of roles. So what does that look like? What does that feel like? Mark, picking up on your earlier points about, what strategic interventions might need to be into teams, and thinking about, the career development of the team that you're working with. What strikes you that's sort of part of that team culture? What sort of changed? What's unique about it?
That's a tough question. I think that for me it comes back to recruitment. Like to have a team culture that you can mold and foster, you must get recruitment right. If you get it wrong, it's anything you do after that is going to be more difficult. So when we are recruiting people, the thing that I prize above all else is a sort of sense of inquisitiveness, and we try and gauge that through the way that we take in applications and the types of questions we ask on interview panels, that kind of thing. A bit like Chris Woods yesterday, I'm not going to give away what we ask in interview, but that's the thing that we try and drill down into. We've had applications in the past where, on paper at least, it's been clear that they've been phenomenally competent programmers, really good technical skills, but if they don't have that sort of excited buzz of learning new things, it's hard for those people to thrive in the type of team that we have and the type of environment that we fostered. So I would always take that inquisitive person, the type of person who maybe comes with a bunch of domain knowledge, but is excited to apply that in areas they know nothing about. So that type of excited person is what I look for. So then I've got a team of 18 now people who are all like that, all with their different strengths and weaknesses technically, and we try build up a mutual respect that means that people really want to help each other do well. So if someone's stuck with some technical problem, they can know that they're backed by a really friendly team who they're not difficult to turn around to and ask, hey, can someone help me with this? There's no it's not competitive in any way. No one's trying to be the best. We all just want the best for each other, and we all understand that as a team around the university, we live and die by our reputation. If there's infighting, our reputation will be terrible, and no one will want to work with us, and we all want the team to do well. So I've been very fortunate that everyone on my team's really bought into that culture, and we sort of almost treat the team as if it's a person. We all want the person to do well and get ahead in its own career. Yeah, I'm very fortunate that I think some of the recruitment decisions we've made have really made that bit quite easy in some sense.
I really liked your turn of phrase there, Mark, concerning, getting recruitment right. Alys, I'm aware that you work across quite a diverse sort of range of different responsibilities and indeed different individuals within those kinds of teams. What, thinking about recruitment, do you think we can do better, or do we get right with regards to recruiting diverse teams in the way that Mark suggests that we need to?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the three different teams within my wider group do have slightly, they have things in common, but they have slightly different cultures within them. I think, as well as all the different sort of technical skills and technical areas that people specialise in, one of the big differences between the teams is those that are permanently responsible for specific systems and have that kind of operational responsibility, and those that engage on a project basis in that kind of RSE team pool model, where they and in those teams, there's quite a focus on people who like variety and people who can very quickly collaborate and engage with and build rapport with the researchers or the engineers that they work with. So there's a real focus on understanding, there's a real focus on their sort of attitude and their ability to relate. Whereas in the more operational teams, that's still important, but there's other aspects. They have to be responsible for critical systems, perhaps, and it's rather a different thing. I mean, I think, especially as teams grow, there is room for a lot of different successful ways of working as well. So we spend a lot of effort, now that the RSE team itself has got 5 different people who are line managers now. We spend a lot of time talking to each other and trying to understand how we can best match types of work that there is to people's skill sets. So I don't think there is only one successful personality type, for instance. Or there are people who are like a deep technical challenge and who you can pass the hard problem to, and that they will come back with a good answer if you give them the time to think it through. And there are people who that you can send out anywhere in the organisation, and they will build that rapport and they will scope out the projects. So I think that is a big part of it. But I very much agree with Mark that the sort of non-negotiable things are that people understand the point of what you're trying to do as a team, that they're really behind the goals. And so for us, that's a combination of a real focus on quality, but being able to couple that with a sort of pragmatic way of applying that in pretty non-typical projects and circumstances, not to be hung up on ideals and not be able to make progress. And then it's that collaborative approach and that support within the team, so that if you engage with the research software engineering team, for instance, what we hope is that you're getting kind of more than the sum of the parts. It's a bit different from just hiring an individual person. When it's needed, you can have the backup of the rest of the team and a really, really broad set of skills that can be called upon.
So going back to then the culture of these kinds of teams, Oz, I'm aware of your longer term experience with regards to working in this kind of area. What do you think has changed within the culture? And a second question to you, if I may, when you were speaking about silos before and kind of the risk there, what do you think needs to be done in order to introduce a sense of rapport within those kinds of team dynamics in the way that Alys and Mark have talked about?
So what has changed over time? Let me address the second question first around silos, because I think that's actually quite important. So one of the challenges when you are looking after multiple teams, and let's not just look at the silo of say an RSE team, is each of those teams will have kind of like a line management piece, and that line manager will, however they do it, will start to introduce their own kind of culture into that team. That's kind of what they're there to do in essence, right? When it's within a thematic of something like an RSE, I think the risks of siloing are less, but I think, as Mark says, you do really have to pay attention to the fact that you don't want the same bits of work kind of heading towards the same person all the time, and that's where they get kind of into a rut, right? So I'm not really talking about ruts here and getting people into a rut. I'm really talking about siloing between groups. So how the RSE team work with the research infrastructure teams, how those infrastructure teams work with web applications teams, or whoever else you've got going on. I think, to me, that is the slightly overarching bigger risk of siloing, and that your RSE team ends up, and I'm not saying I see this, but there is risks is what I'm saying I see. There is risk around an RSE team heading off down their own kind of route and not recognizing the fact that working more closely with the infrastructure team provides a better overall service or a better overall deliverable to the researcher, than independently working, as a them and us relationship. So I think that was more what I was kind of thinking in my mind about the risks of siloing, than kind of the RSE team being or RSE engineers being kind of falling into a rut of always doing the same type of work. I will agree kind of like 100% with Mark on one of the key parts about recruitment that I've learned over many years is you can always teach the right person technical skills. You can teach that. What you cannot teach somebody is those soft skills. They are what they are. By the time they come to your door, they are what they are. You can't teach them anything around who they are at that point. So yeah, identifying those kind of soft skills and saying what are the key ones, the most important ones to you. Inquisitiveness, perfectly good one, right? Communication skills, all those kind of soft skills that you almost can't be taught in some way. You can get a level of teaching about it, but you can't really be fundamentally changed in what you are. And I have to admit, I've totally forgotten what your first question was. so you might want to come back to that first question, because I got a little bit hung up on the second one.
That was no problem. So first question was about going back to the context of culture, and perhaps how the culture has changed in terms of the team culture, but also the perception of this kind of professional role within organizations, and indeed larger or indeed smaller institutions.
Yeah, so how it's changed over time, I think, if I look back to who were kind of those research technology professionals 20 odd years ago, they were tending to be all PhDs. There were people who had just come out of their PhD. They kind of didn't really want an academic role. They didn't fit or didn't like it particularly, but they kind of wanted to be still kind of attached to that research world in some way. So, as I said, they were like, most people who come out of kind of, there were physicists, chemists, very hard scientists in those days, very attuned to the research process, so they kind of understood the research process, what was going on, so they could speak the same language to the kind of small subset of researchers that, 20 years ago you were dealing with. I think over time, as well as it becoming much more complicated, what was expected of the service, but clearly what has also changed was the reach. So, I think you had the odd occasional biologist and the odd occasional humanities or arts person 20 years ago. There were these unicorns that popped up, and you could apply a lot of help in those areas, but now that's kind of mainstream. Biologists are mainstream, medics are mainstream in terms of what you do. So, those kind of skill sets that you had 20 years ago in understanding CFD or understanding FE or any of those, or MD or any of those kind of things, kind of become a little bit less relevant now to the types of people you're having to work with on a daily basis and the kind of research that you're having to do. One of the things I found a little bit confusing when I talk about RSEs is what exactly is an RSE, right? I'm sure there are thousands of definitions. I don't want anyone to give me a definition. I'm sure I've had them all and I've forgotten most of them, so clearly they didn't stick particularly, but that's fine. So I think one of the challenges or one of the newer areas I see kind of emerging all the time, and I actually genuinely have no idea what to do with it, is these kind of web application developer roles. Right? Is that a RSE or no? If I want somebody to build a web application that's attached to a database and does all these very interesting things, is that an RSE? Yeah, someone says yes. There's a yes in the room. Okay, so that's cool. So I think no one talks about those as a kind of RSE type role. It's certainly not in my mind as an RSE type role. To me, it's programming and NPI and those kinds of things very much. So I probably have a fairly a view of an RSE that's probably 10 years old, probably. Right? But I think these new, there's always this evolution of what a particular role is. What an RSE is today is not necessarily what an RSE was. In fact, I guarantee you it was not an RSE what an RSE was when an RSE was defined 10, 12 years ago, right? What we saw as RSEs 10, 12 years ago that created this whole RSE push to get that recognized was these people that sat in research groups that were developing research software and had no future. And this whole badging of an RSE was an attempt to give them a future, to give them a career development. So I think what we have seen is that as the ecosystem has begun to see new areas that the being research-led, and we're being led by what the researchers are doing. We've picked up on what their needs have been and said, is this a good place? Is it a good fit? Is it a good place for me to put this kind of capability within a research group, within a department? Do I need to centralize it? So I think that change is something which is continuous. If you go back, I go back 30 years, you would have seen the research infrastructure professionals would have been inside a department, they'd have been inside a research group. And as it began to scale out, as it began to be something that was much larger, you looked at it and said, well, bloody hell, I can't have it there, because I just can't deal with that critical mass. It's becoming so important. Actually, I have to move it to a departmental level, or I have to move it to a school level, or I have to move it to a central level. So I think this kind of evolution of capability that started in a research group and now ends up being as some giant centralized services now creates its own challenges about, okay, so what do you recruit for now? Because you're not recruiting a unicorn anymore, you're recruiting 20, 30, 40, 50 people, right, to fulfill a set of roles. And that's a very different environment to, I think, where this all started, and brings a huge amount of challenges around this. I'm a great believer in research computing sitting inside an IT organization. I'm a great believer in that, because I think that's the kind of direction of travel. I think as you look at IT in general, I think that gradually is being moved from an on-prem and internal activity to an external activity. Research computing support of research computing is moving out from a department to a more centralized, just like IT did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, just like IT did, we're doing that. And you can see that maybe 20 years from now, there's components of it that simply will never have existed internally. So I think you have to think about these all as being on the same kind of evolutionary path. That's something I certainly can see between where research computing is, research software engineers, all of that, and where IT was 20, 30 years ago. We're on exactly the same path. I'm really hoping I answered that question in some way.
I think you did. I'm just going to bring in a couple of comments and one question from the chat. So the first is from Nikki, which was a question around looking at the strengths and weaknesses of a team. Do we look to recruit to fill the gap, or do we prefer to train and develop the people that we already have? And I think we've had some good responses to that in terms of, you know, what everyone has been saying this morning about that sense of culture, but also the value and incentives within the heart of those kinds of team dynamics. And the risk of siloing those roles, and how perhaps we draw people out of their comfort zones into new development and indeed career growth areas. Good comment from Christopher Woods here, who in response to your question, Oz, concerning who is an RSE. So I think Chris has an answer for us here. He's more towards Oz's side. There's a difference between a software engineer and a research software engineer. Key is developing software that's used in research, which has a different development cycle and way of capturing requirements compared to developing, for example, a mobile game or a spreadsheet or an office app. And a question from Simon here. So it seems that it's been very successful to promote the job title, role and career of RSE. So this is specific to the label, but it feels like that has left the system administration side of things behind. How do we do the same thing for other roles? Perhaps this is a question we need the panel to answer and respond to. Mariann, I'm wondering, in terms of particularly the value of your role, and sort of particularly when you step forward for advocacy and community, as a community manager as well. What do you think about Simon's question here in terms of the system administrator side of things, and how do we do the same for kind of other roles within the scope of RSEs? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we touched on this over the past few days a couple of times, and I want to point again to our community board, where we have the job advert for a 20% FTE RIE theme lead in an HCIR, and the idea of this role is to do exactly this. To build kind of a community of research infrastructure engineers and think about ways to lobby for this role and to bring people together and have a bigger voice, basically, by coming together. But we also talked about going a bit back from the siloing. Do we want a wider community of DRI professionals? Do we need all these siloed communities? So I know that in the RSE community we do have people coming along from all types of jobs. So, and once, for example, somebody from Supercomputing Wales told me that he just likes to come along to this community, although he's not quite sure whether he's allowed to, because he's not an RSE. But the HPC community as such, in his view, didn't have this kind of atmosphere and this kind of community feeling and the openness. So I think if we if we just can work together and then basically have our subgroups maybe that discuss certain career paths or so, but don't let every community fight their own fight on their own. That might be the way to go. So we can learn from each other, and we can talk to each other, and we can see what worked for one group and what didn't work for one group, and we can advocate for each other.
It strikes me that part of what we've been talking about this morning is around values and recognition, and we're cautiously been sort of stepping around equality, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm going to bring that in now. Given the expansion of the teams and your experience, Mark, and the depth and the breadth of your experience, Oz, in terms of your different perspectives, I just wanted to hear from both of you first in terms of your thoughts around how EDI has been incorporated within the teams that you work within, and perhaps what you would like to do differently there, or what has been most successful in terms of those kinds of approaches. And then I'll ask the same question to Alys and Mariann.
So I get this question a lot. We have a fairly balanced in terms of gender team, and quite a few leaders have asked me like what we've done to get to that place? And the brutally honest answer is I actually don't know. So the only answer I can really come up with is that we put a ton of effort into our job advert and description. So in I think it was the 2017 conference, it might be 28, one of the conferences, I went to a workshop on recruitment that was run by Matt Johnson from Microsoft Research, and went straight back to Newcastle armed with a bunch of knowledge of rewriting our job advert. I think it's a case of casting the recruitment net as wide as you possibly can to get as diverse an input as you can. But then once you get to that interview stage, it's all about guarding against bias, but being fair across the board. By the time we're making decisions as to who we're going to hire, we're hiring the best candidates, the best people. The way you get more diverse teams is by having more diverse input into that process. So everyone who we've employed is there on merit, that it's because they're good programmers, they're good RSEs. But casting that recruitment net wide is something that we've managed to do. I also think some of it just comes down to geography. So Newcastle's got quite a vibrant tech scene. There's a good number of startups, small businesses, but then there's also quite large government departments. So there's elements of HMRC and a couple of others. So you end up, people move around the region working for different size employers. So there's quite a fertile ground for when you want to employ, there's usually people around. So maybe some of it is just unique to geography. But yeah, we've put some work into the recruitment process.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, definitely. I think the last comment was key. Really, it's about the recruitment process and casting your net as wide as possible, so you have as many people coming in through the front door. But ultimately, you'll always pick the best of the best, right? Because that's what you're really interested in. I will make a comment. I mean, I look around this room, and if and again, I keep going back, right? But I think it's important to know the kind of journey we've been on as a community over the last few decades. And I look around this room, and some things have changed dramatically. You know, I look and there are women here for a start, which is a massive change from where we started. I mean, if I go back to the meetings I had with these special interest groups, HPC special interest group, or any of those kind of early meetings, there would just simply not be a woman in the room, period. Right? There would not be a woman in the room. So clearly there has been some progress. I'd be really, really interested to know how many of the women in the room are from the RSE side versus the research infrastructure side, or from the community side versus the TPM side. So I don't see hardly any change in the research infrastructure side. I don't see particularly any change in that over the last 20, 30 years. Don't know why that is, but just not seeing it. On the research software engineering side, I've seen a lot of change, a lot of diversity in that area, which is great. I think one of the key learnings we've had probably over the last few years has been to allow for a much greater flexibility in working patterns. It is just true that that women have the majority of the care and responsibility. It is just true, right? And so if you're expecting a kind of a 9 to 5 to happen, that can create a problem. Right? So we've been a lot more flexible about people working 50% of the time, working 70% of the time. Working, from 10, not having core hours. We don't have core hours. We expect you we're much more output driven, so I expect you to do the work. I don't care whether you're coming at 9 to do the work or coming at 12 to do the work. As long as the output's there, who cares, right? So I think that flexibility has really turned around. When I came to Cambridge, there were no women in the team, not one. Out of a team of 20, not one, which was a bit embarrassing. We're not making massive strides, but there are definitely women now in the team, right? Which so it's an infinite progression over the last couple of years, right? And that I think with us trying to be much more open about much more flexible about the fact that that the work is output driven and not time served. Right? So it's not time serving. It's not a presenteeism issue. It's about how that's delivered. And I think moving towards hybrid working as well, and we're pushing really, really hard for that to happen. We're doing it regardless of what the university says, and we'll just pick up the pieces later. But right now, we're very interested in remote working, very much more open about hybrid working. And that is a real change in, I think, opportunity we have taken over the last couple of years. And that, again, has brought many more women into the group and much more opportunity around it. But actually, I think the key thing is to get the advert right. That talks to that openness, that flexibility, that inclusion. Getting that advert right is the thing that will bring the right people through the door.
We've had similar conversations at Durham at length about getting that advert right. So I certainly agree with that approach. Shifting the EDI question slightly for Mariann and Alys, although please respond to the previous one if you want to. So getting beyond how EDI is incorporated, I'm interested to hear your perspectives about how EDI is sustained, either within your current role or your current experiences or previous roles and previous experiences. So kind of the after the recruitment, what needs to happen to kind of sustain those kinds of EDI benchmarks that we have, and in particular, I'm thinking about how we keep and retain professionals from any kind of minority group based on age, gender, whatever it is. But how do we keep and sustain those professionals within their roles, and we don't lose them after we have recruited the best of the best? Alys, Mariann, what are your thoughts here?
Is it me first? Yes. Hi. Yes, this is a really tricky one, and it's hard not to feel like we do keep having the same conversations, and that I feel like potentially every new sort of batch of people, and especially as a woman in a very male-dominated fields throughout my entire career, you start off and you think, oh, wonderful, there's this huge focus on it and there's this huge energy around it. And then you sort of realize that this has actually been the case for decades. And, it's kind of easy to say the right things, but it's not actually easy to change the kind of culture and everything surrounding it that is always pushing things back, in the direction that it's come from. One thing I think needs to be thought about is, yes, you cannot just focus on recruitment. You can't just expect people from a very different set of backgrounds or demographics to come into roles that can then stay exactly the same as they always have been and can work in the way that they always have worked, because there's a whole dynamic around that, and there's probably a reason that doesn't sort of support progression or feel comfortable to a wider set of people. It's very much a mold that has evolved, and we have to sort of constantly challenge ourselves to see where is that just inherently the way the job is and has to be, or where is it just the way we're used to seeing that job done and the mold we're used to seeing it. I mean, I think you just can't underestimate the impact of the sort of unconscious impact of people feeling like the odd one out, or feeling like they stand out, or feeling like they're constantly expected to be sort of breaking down barriers and challenging things. So I think it's actually quite important not to put the kind of onus on the people who are in that minority group to sort of do all of that work of, overcoming those things. So the emphasis on it being sort of everybody's job, and we really need to try to unpick the way things have always been done, not just say, hooray, we've ticked a box and, more people have come in the door. But okay, what does that mean then, and what are all the uncomfortable things we're going to have to do differently to sustain that?
Mariann, same question to you in terms of sustainability. So after the recruitment has happened, we have the best of the best, thinking about how we sustain those diverse teams and make things more inclusive at a long-term level so we don't lose good people. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah. So over the past year, when I looked a bit deeper into some EDI questions, I must say it's hard to do that and not despair. So the more you look at it, the more problems you see. And what's also true is that if you're in a minority group, that there will always be the negative sides, and there might just be the little nagging sides, or there might be the side of being on a lot of committees. So I've spoken to a lot of women, for example, who are invited onto all the hiring committees because there has to be a woman, and so there's all this additional work that you have to do. And I've also come across the concept recently of the diversity tax, which means that, okay, you want to change something and you want to make it more diverse, but you then put in the effort and you do something about it, which means that you spend less time on your actual work. And I see so many great women in technical fields who then become the EDI person somewhere and are no longer working that much in the technical field. And that's really disappointing. But I mean, there are so many more aspects than gender to diversity. But just that's my personal experience. What I've experienced in my current job is what a difference it makes if you're not the only person from that minority. And if you are not the one who has to prove basically that to the world that your group is capable of doing this kind of work, and that you have someone to talk to and to complain to, and someone basically on the team who's your ally and backs you up, and you're just not on your own. So that's really important. So if you need a token person, hire 2 token persons of that group, and that will already make a difference, I think.
It strikes me when we were talking earlier about what is the specific culture within the RSEs. What we're really talking about within team dynamics here is a culture of change, whether it's around recruitment and incorporation, and a head nod or a genuine desire to change things around diversity and inclusivity, but also a culture of change in terms of how conflicts arise within teams and how they are managed as well. And we've just finished living through, we're still living through the global pandemic, and indeed the impact of that. And Oz, you were talking about the shift into flexible working, into hybrid working, where things are very much project-based rather than kinds of hours-based, getting away from the traditional 9 to 5. And I think you're right, that has really opened things up in a very positive way, if something positive can come out of the last, excuse my language, crap 2 years that we have all been through. I'm wondering then that perhaps there is, as you started, Mariann, I empathize with you a lot, and indeed Alys as well, that it feels pretty bleak once you start looking at the EDI stuff, and it's hard not to get discouraged and to feel that all your energy is kind of tapped into something that really should have been resolved decades ago and is still the same problem. I'm wondering then if anyone from the panel can respond to, perhaps there is a silver lining that is on its way to us in terms of the combination of what COVID has forced us to do in terms of, team dynamics and the culture of work, and indeed the opportunities going forwards in terms of recruitment and sustaining individuals within those kinds of teams. So basically what's happened in terms of our day-to-day working practices, and how we kind of, micromanage those kinds of issues within a team dynamic, and what perhaps has come out of COVID in terms of forcing us to sort of rework in a more hybrid way, a more flexible way. Does that sort of point us towards a bit more of a positive silver lining? I appreciate there's still a lot more that needs to be done in terms of of EDI in particular. I was just wondering if anyone on the panel wanted to respond to that.
So I will say that, from my perspective, the pandemic has been a really tremendous opportunity to introduce change, right, and to get that change to stick. Whether or not our parent organizations have I'm not quite sure what word to use there, have the ability to sustain that level of change, or they just flop back into their kind of pre-pandemic thinking of a 9 to 5 is important? I genuinely don't know. I don't know how many places have already introduced policies around things like flexible working. Certainly, I know that Cambridge has said it's not going to introduce anything until 2023, by which time I suspect most of the decisions and stuff will already have been made. I'm assuming other universities out there are somewhat more fleet of foot and have already started to think about those things. So I think that's a real positive opportunity. I think one of the biggest issues is kind of what's the downside, right? I mean, you're now changing all the dynamic around a team. You're changing that face-to-face. We are all kind of just out of the trees, right? We have not long from the trees. I don't think a pandemic fundamentally changes the way people think and feel. It may open an opportunity to do that, but it's not going to change that in the short term. So there are real challenges, and I'm sure everyone's had these discussions about how do you, if someone is now working completely remotely, and say 30%, 40%, 50% aren't, they're in the office every day, who gets seen, who gets noticed, what contribution? How do you notice people's contribution now? You notice that in a slightly different way, because you've got people remote and you've got people sat right in front of you. If you're a manager and you're in, and all your people, and you've got 50% of your people in and 50% of your people not in, you're interacting with that 50%. And we're only human. People we touch and feel around us, that relationship is very different to the remote hybrid relationship I have with a chair at this point, right? I keep feeling myself turning this way to talk to people as opposed to talk to a screen, but that's because it's kind of inbuilt in you, right? So I think there are real opportunities, but we must not be blind to the real risks that we are now putting, or the new challenges we're throwing up. Maybe that's the way to think about it, right? There are new challenges that throws up, and we have to be really, really on the ball to kind of keep an eye on those things. I think that could be quite destructive if we're not paying attention. So I think there's real opportunities, but we've got to keep our kind of eyes open that it's not all a beautiful golden sunrise, right? There are issues out there.
We've got 10 minutes to the end of the session, so please, if you're in the room
thing?
and you want to put your hand in the air to ask a question, please do so. Or if you want to type into the chat, I am keeping an eye on that.
Okay.
I just want to pick up on your reflection there, actually, Oz, very quickly as well, in terms of the new challenges that open up. And I'm wondering if any of our other panel... Oh, Oz wants to say more. Please do.
Sorry, I thought you were about to. I wanted you to say one thing. There's this big thing going on around recruitment and retention, right? Retention. Everyone's really, really worried about retention. I think, I certainly wasn't until I kind of came to Cambridge. I had a really interesting conversation with Paul Collegia, which kind of, I think, put a slightly different spin on what we mean by retention. I think one of the chief goals in some way about what we do is we help people's career to develop. Right? So for some people, that career development means they have to leave your organization to develop their career. That should be something that we should embrace as a community. We shouldn't be attempting, to keep everybody under our kind of wing in our roles. We should be, helping people to develop. So I don't think we're not as paranoid about retention. We don't want people to just jump ship randomly, right, just because they want to get out. You want people to develop their careers out of your organization into much better jobs, which pay them a huge amount, and you want them crying as they go out the door because they've had such a lovely time with you, right? But you want them to develop and move out your organisation. So I don't really see. I'm not as wedded, I think, to this retention issue. I think, but that does then leave us with challenges about how then we fill that pipeline of people coming through the door. Yeah. But that's just life, right? It's life. Sorry. Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, opening it up to the room now. Any questions in the room, or indeed on the chat? I can't see any new ones on the chat, so opening up to those of you sat in the room there.
Yeah, hi. So on the EDI stuff, I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, it's immensely important, and there is sort of a retention issue in terms of keeping people from minority groups and keeping women in software, in HPC, in science. But the issues, they start really, really early. So like, for example, so my background's physics. The amount of boys who take a physics A level in the UK the percentage of boys is 3 times greater than the percentage of girls. Now that means that, like I actually think that the amount of people who take physics A level is too small anyway. I think, a lot of people would like it that don't take it regardless of gender, but clearly girls are not taking it as often as boys are. So at least, like, we're kind of missing out on like 3 times as many potential women who could go on to be great physicists. And it's not just kind of from a self-interest point of view. I think physics and science is wonderful, and this is something that people are missing out on, and it is very sad. We can't sort of ignore these issues. A lot of things play into this. It's not just along gender boundaries, it's along race boundaries, it's along class boundaries. And so how do we resolve this? I mean, do you, like, if an individual organization does superbly on things like women in tech, and it has, basically a 50-50 gender split, that's brilliant. But if those women were already in tech, we're not solving the issue, we're shuffling the women around. So the issue, what role do you see outreach playing in this? How can we as organizations and we as employees in those organizations go out and actually attempt to inspire and persuade and convince people, young people, why they should be following the paths that lead them into these sort of roles? And how can we kind of try to attempt to even more grander, just restructure a society in a way that allows that to happen? What roles can we play in that?
Wow, that's kind of deep.
Can I maybe say a bit about that? So I've been involved in a program, not recently, but when I was a postdoc, called STEM Ambassadors. And I thought that was a great program, so where you could sign up, you got like a little bit of training, not too much, but but they had a database of different outreach activities, often in schools or so, where you could either come to a school class and talk to a school class, or be at career fairs and so, or did like mock interview things or so. And I got the feedback that actually made a difference for the classes I spoke to go there and to tell them about my work and to tell them about the team I work with and the diversity also in terms of where the people came from and so, and just doing this role model work. But that's again kind of the diversity tax thing as well. So you have to then go out there and show yourself there to inspire people or to be a role model.
And I think that's absolutely right. I think that's probably the only time in tokenism that I think kind of makes sense. So like my colleague, yes, I was asked to be on many EDI panels over the years. I always said no to every single one of them. But I think there are some roles where actually you have to have, a guy talking to a bunch of female students about how great it is to be a female or how great science is not sending the kind of message you want at that level. You have a real problem. You're absolutely right. The nail on the head. We're right at the very end of this process, and we're trying to make a difference right at the very end of that process, right? So we do what little we can with what we've got, right? But ultimately, the problem starts when they're 5 and 6, right? And the decisions about what they want to do start at that kind of age. And I don't know, man. I ain't gonna lie to you, right? STEM ambassadors is all great, but it's all bits and pieces, right? I mean, you think we are women when they're 5 or 6 or 7. Where are those children finding out what do they want to be? How many of them want to be an astronaut when they're 6 and a Barbie doll when they're 9, or whatever it turns out to be, right? What creates those changes? What are those influences? That's kind of outside my pay scale. I have no idea how you fix that.
Can I just chip in on maybe a bit later in what we term the leaky pipeline? So I'm on the committee of BCS Women, and one of the things that our big event of the year, if you like, is a thing called the Lovelace Colloquium, which is for computer science women undergraduates. And it's a great event. There's a poster competition, and every year there are something like 150 women undergrads present posters, and there are companies that come along, and quite a lot of them get recruited, and there's been a big success of women staying in computing careers where they might otherwise have leaked out into other stuff. So there are initiatives out there, and I mean, I personally think that that would be a great event for the RSE community to get involved in, get some of those great women into the RSE community. So It's actually it's coming up something like April the 4th, something like that. So if you, and it's free to attend, and it's online this year. So if anyone wants to go, sit in, see all their posters. I've just got the thing about I'm doing poster judging, so I've got some of those to look at soon. But yeah, it's a great event. So things like that keep certainly women in the community.
Just checking, we had another question coming. Okay, we are at the end of the session this morning, and just time to thank our panel for their time and indeed their tolerance of kind of the hybrid mode. I know this is different and we're trying it out, but actually I think it's working okay. It's pretty good this end, so I don't know what it's like your end. We've had a really good discussion, everything from kind of the culture within the tech teams to how we sustain and develop individuals within those teams and how we can kind of upskill. And indeed, of course, we left, I would say, the most exciting and perhaps the big issue of the day, perhaps to the end of the session, which is always going to be around recruitment and sustainability within teams, particularly with an EDI edge. So thank you so much for all your time this morning, everyone in attendance, in particular our panel. So perhaps you join with me in giving them some applause digitally and indeed in person.